At 10:45 on the morning of February 6, 1952, a bulletin was issued from Sandringham House in Norfolk. The wording was precise and brief. The king had retired to rest the previous night in his usual health and had passed peacefully away in his sleep early that morning. By 11:15, BBC newsreader John Snagge was reading those words to the nation. "It's with the greatest sorrow that we make the following announcement." The broadcast repeated every 15 minutes, 7 times, before the radio went silent for 5 hours. Two facts about that morning are worth holding separately. The king died at some point during the night. No exact time was recorded because no one knew until morning. His valet found him in bed at approximately 7:30 a.m. The time of death, the time of discovery, and the 10:45 Sandringham communiqué, 3 separate moments, passing in silence from one to the next before the world knew anything. The Sebastopol bell at Windsor Castle, a Crimean War trophy rung only upon a royal death, tolled 56 times that afternoon, once for each year of his life, between 1:27 and 2:22 p.m. In London, the bells of Westminster Abbey rang. The Great Tom Bell at St. Paul's Cathedral tolled every minute for 2 hours. In Birmingham, 10,000 people gathered in the street for the accession proclamation. In Edinburgh, 15,000. But the nation grieved the king. The woman who had been his queen for 16 years was grieving something else as well. Something that had no coffin, no burial service, and no bell to mark it. She had just lost her rank. And in the weeks that followed, the question of what she intended to do about that would shape the British monarchy for the next half-century. George VI had spent February 5th at Sandringham in something like ordinary comfort. The estate covers 20,000 acres of Norfolk farmland and woodland, and in winter, it has the quality of a very large, very private domestic life. That afternoon, the king had gone out to shoot hares on the grounds. He came back in. He had dinner with his family. He retired to bed between 10 and 10:30 that night, reported by those around him as being in his usual health. That phrase would appear almost verbatim in the Sandringham communiqué the following morning. He had not seemed like a man spending his last evening on earth. He was 56 years old. He had been a heavy smoker for roughly 40 years. He had also, 5 months earlier, lost his entire left lung. On September 23, 1951, a team of surgeons converted the Bull Room at Buckingham Palace into an operating theater, bringing in emergency lighting and equipment from Westminster Hospital. The room was stripped of its usual furnishings and fitted with surgical apparatus. The lead surgeon was Sir Clement Price Thomas, a pioneering Welsh thoracic surgeon whose career had been built on work in pulmonary tuberculosis. The procedure was a left pneumonectomy, the complete, irreversible removal of the left lung. The diagnosis was bronchial carcinoma, lung cancer. The king was told none of this. The official public language used structural abnormalities and obstruction of the left bronchus. He was reportedly told the operation had cleared a blockage. The diagnosis of carcinoma was withheld from the public, from most of the medical profession, and, according to multiple historical accounts, from the king himself. This wasn't unusual for the era. In mid-20th century Britain, doctors routinely avoided the word cancer in patient communications and in public health education. The assumption was that to name it was to pronounce a death sentence, and that the pronouncement itself was crueler than the disease's own calendar. The silence was considered an act of mercy. What it produced, in this case, was a household emotionally unprepared for an outcome that was, medically, entirely foreseeable. Cancer had already spread to his right lung. Arteriosclerotic heart disease, aggravated by 4 decades of cigarettes, was doing its own work alongside. The official cause of death recorded on February 6th was coronary thrombosis. There is no clinical reason to dispute that finding, but the cancer was the context. The September operation had bought him 4 months. The last publicly documented photographs of George VI were taken on January 31st, 1952, at London Airport. He was standing on the tarmac in an overcoat, waving goodbye to Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip, who were departing for a Commonwealth tour. Kenya first, then Australia, then New Zealand. In those photographs, his face is hollowed out. The gauntness is visible. People who saw him that day noticed it. 6 days later, he was dead. What his wife knew, and when she knew it, can't be established from primary sources. No letter or diary entry from the Queen survives that records when she was privately informed of the full diagnosis, if she ever was, explicitly. She must have suspected. The photographs from January 31st leave little room for hope. But the culture of that household and of that era ran toward silence rather than confrontation, toward carrying the weight without acknowledging its exact dimensions. What she knew privately isn't what the record shows, and the record shows very little. His valet found him at approximately 7:30 in the morning of February 6th. The household had a code for this kind of news, Hyde Park Corner, and the code was passed by telephone to Buckingham Palace to prevent switchboard operators from intercepting it before the official announcement was prepared. For the next 3 hours, while the communiqué was being drafted and the world's radio stations and newspaper offices were being quietly alerted, the king was dead, and almost no one knew. At 10:45, the official bulletin from Sandringham was released. At 11:15, the BBC broadcast began. At 5 p.m., the Accession Council met in the entree room of St. James's Palace to confirm Elizabeth II as her father's successor. She was in Kenya. She had spent the night before at the Treetops Hotel in the Aberdare Forest, sleeping while her father died. It was Philip who broke the news to her at Sagana Lodge, where they had returned the next morning. The royal party immediately began preparations to return to London. Back at Sandringham, the estate staff continued the work of a household in mourning. The coffin was dressed. The king's body was placed in the Church of St. Mary Magdalene on the estate, where he had worshipped when he was there. His wife, the woman who had been Queen of the United Kingdom for 16 years, oversaw the beginning of ceremonies in which her own position had already been eclipsed. She was 51 years old. She had been widowed for less than a day. Over the 9 days between his death and his funeral, 304,000 people queued for up to 4 miles outside Westminster Hall to file past his coffin. They stood in the February cold for hours. Parliament met at 11:58 a.m. on the day of his death, expressed its grief, and adjourned. Memorial services were held in churches of all denominations across the country and around the world, in some cases, even in communist states. Other nations declared periods of national mourning: Australia, Canada, New Zealand, India. Richard Dimbleby's BBC radio commentary, delivered during the Lying in State, described the scene in language that hasn't dated. The oak of Sandringham, hidden beneath the rich golden folds of the standard. The slow flicker of the candles touches gently the gems of the imperial crown. Never safer, better guarded, lay a sleeping king than this, with a golden candlelight to warm his resting place, and the muffled footsteps of his devoted subjects to keep him company. Grief was national and genuine and enormous. But underneath the public ceremony, something else was beginning to settle. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had married Prince Albert, Bertie, to the family, in April 1923 at Westminster Abbey. She had not done so easily. He had proposed more than once, and she had declined more than once. Her own reported reservation was painfully specific. She feared she would be afraid never, never again to be free to think, speak, and act as I feel I really ought to. It took 3 proposals before she accepted. She wasn't a woman who surrendered her independence lightly, or her identity at all. Once she married, the marriage was real. The biographer, Robert Lacey, who had extensive access to people who knew the family closely, described it in terms that have become the standard biographical shorthand. In their marriage, she gave him strength. He gave her purpose. George VI was, by multiple contemporary accounts, a difficult man. Highly strung, prone to violent temper tantrums his family privately called gnashes, someone haunted throughout his reign by a persistent sense of inadequacy beside his charismatic elder brother Edward. He had the stammer, which had required years of therapy. He had the shyness, which never fully left him. He had the weight of a crown that had been forced onto him by his brother's exit. In 1947, writing to his daughter Elizabeth on her wedding day, he described his wife in a single sentence. "You know, for me, Mummy is simply the most wonderful person in the world." That is a letter from a man in love with his wife, written in the middle of his reign, and it doesn't read like protocol. It reads like someone who has found, after years of difficulty and public performance and private suffering, the one person who makes the whole thing navigable. She had held him up through the abdication, through the coronation, through 6 years of the worst war in human history, through the post-war austerity and the exhaustion of the 1940s. He wrote to his daughter about his wife in the language of someone who couldn't imagine existing without her. When George VI died in the early hours of February 6th, the grief she felt wasn't performance. He had been the organizing principle of her adult life for 29 years. The loss was real, deep, and privately devastating by every biographical account that attempts to reach it. And yet, within days of his death, she had also lost something else, something harder to mourn in public because it had no coffin and no obituary. She had been queen for 16 years. Now she wasn't. To understand what that meant to her, you have to go back to 1936. Not to the war years, not to the coronation, to the moment the crown arrived, unbidden and unwanted, in the Yorks' drawing room. On December 11, 1936, Edward VIII abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson. Albert, who had been the Duke of York, became King George VI within hours. By every account, he was genuinely terrified. He had been raised in the certainty that his older brother Edward would be king, had spent 30 years as the second son, and had organized his entire adult life around that comfortable precedence. He had no training in constitutional law, no preparation for state duties at the level they would require, and a stammer that made public speaking an ordeal. He broke down when he heard the news. His biographers record it. He wasn't a man who concealed his emotions easily in private, whatever discipline he maintained in public. She wasn't composed about it either. By her own reported account, and the sourcing here runs through secondary biographies rather than a primary document she left behind, the abdication crisis was a blow from which she thought they would never recover. She reportedly called Wallis Simpson "that woman" for the rest of her life, and, by multiple biographical accounts, never said her name aloud in company. Biographers have argued, characterization rather than confirmed quotation, that she believed the weight of the unwanted throne had shortened her husband's life. He died at 56, having spent 15 of those years carrying something he had been given without consent. The cancer in his lungs was there long before anyone found it. The cigarettes that fed it had been there for decades. Whether the crown accelerated that decline is a question no pathologist can answer. She believed it did. That belief shaped everything. The abdication had made the crown something they had to earn rather than inherit. They had clawed it back, or had it clawed onto them, at great cost, and had spent 16 years paying that cost in public performance and private sacrifice. Tony Skevington, analyzing George VI's character and career in a detailed academic paper, noted something about his wife that more effusive tributes tend to glide over. Beneath what he called the affable veneer, there was a very strong, extremely sensible, shrewd, and, some would say, ruthless woman. Foreign diplomats in the years before the Second World War, Skevington observed, had dismissed the king as a dull non-entity, but they all commented on the queen's steely character and the need to treat her with caution. That character would matter enormously in the weeks after February 6, 1952, because the crown that had been taken from them once and rebuilt at enormous cost was now passing to the next generation, and she was the one being asked to step aside. By February 1952, she was arguably the most popular person in Britain. That claim has no single opinion poll behind it. Mass observation, which tracked British public opinion during and after the war, used qualitative methods rather than percentage approval ratings. But the evidence for the claim is structural, and it explains the 50-year dynamic that followed. On September 13, 1940, 5 high-explosive bombs struck Buckingham Palace during the Blitz. The King and Queen were in residence and weren't injured. A 50-kilogram bomb had already fallen in the palace grounds 5 days earlier without exploding. When the palace itself was hit, the significance was immediate and calculated. Here was the symbol of British nationhood, bombed, damaged, stripped of its chapel, its inner quadrangle cracked, its gates shattered. And the King and Queen had been there. Her response, widely reported, the exact wording varying slightly between accounts, but the sentiment consistent, was direct. "I am glad we have been bombed. Now we can look the East End in the eye." The East End of London had been absorbing German bombs for weeks before the palace took a hit. Working-class Londoners had watched the fires, dug out their neighbors, buried their dead, and listened to the BBC tell them they were fighting for civilization. Now the palace where the King and Queen lived had a hole in it too. The phrase moved fast. It found its audience. Whether she said face or eye, and the versions vary, the meaning was the same. We are in this together, and I know it now because the bombs found me too. She visited bombed areas repeatedly throughout the Blitz and the rest of the war. The East End near London's docks, provincial cities that had taken sustained hits, Plymouth after the devastating raids of March 1941. Those visits initially provoked hostility in some neighborhoods. Rubbish was thrown at her. People jeered. She wore expensive clothes in streets full of rubble, and some of the people watching her knew exactly what that gap meant. She acknowledged this directly. If the public came to see her, she reasoned, they would wear their best clothes, so she should reciprocate. Norman Hartnell dressed her in what he described as the colors of the rainbow of hope. She kept going back. When the cabinet advised evacuating the princesses to Canada, she refused. The recorded statement varies slightly in wording across sources, but the position does not. "The children won't go without me. I won't leave the king, and the king will never leave." Elizabeth and Margaret spent the war years at Windsor Castle. They remained in Britain. Whatever the technical limitations of that safety, Windsor was still in England, still accessible to German bombers. The symbolism of not going was understood and received. The princesses were in Britain. So were their parents. So was everyone else. Adolf Hitler reportedly described her as the most dangerous woman in Europe. That phrase circulates widely in historical accounts, attributed to Hitler as a measure of her significance as a morale builder. A primary German language source confirming that exact wording has never been firmly established, but the assessment the phrase describes, that her presence on bombed streets, her refusal to flee, her combination of warmth and stubbornness, was doing genuine damage to German psychological warfare against British civilian morale, is supported by what she was actually doing. She was holding something together that was trying to come apart. By 1945, that work had calcified into something close to myth. 7 years later, by February 1952, the myth was intact and the warmth was genuine. A 25-year-old who had just learned her father was dead while she was 4,000 miles away in Kenya had very limited options when it came to managing a widowed mother whose public standing in Britain exceeded her own. The country would mourn the Queen Mother. You couldn't challenge that in public. You couldn't compete with it. What Elizabeth II grasped in those first weeks, and she grasped things quickly, having been prepared for this role since she was 10 years old, was that you managed it, quietly, and indefinitely. That silent management began almost immediately. On February 15, 1952, 9 days after the death, the funeral of George VI took place at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. The procession had covered 3.5 miles from New Palace Yard to Paddington Station, the coffin drawn on a gun carriage hauled by Royal Navy seamen, as is traditional at the funerals of British sovereigns. The central band of the RAF and the band of the Welsh Guards led the way. Behind the coffin walked 4 royal dukes: Edinburgh, Gloucester, Windsor, and Kent. Elizabeth II, the Queen Mother, Princess Margaret, and the Princess Royal traveled in a carriage. At the chapel steps, something small and precise happened. As the coffin bearers carried the king toward the entrance, Elizabeth II gave way to usual precedence in allowing her mother to proceed ahead of her. The Queen of the United Kingdom deferred to the Queen Mother at the door of her father's funeral. Protocol said this was correct. The mother takes precedence. The optics of it were something else entirely. That small, formally required gesture at the chapel door would repeat, in one form or another, for 50 years. In the weeks immediately after the king's death, what the Queen Mother's inner life looked like is genuinely difficult to verify, and the script of her life, if it's to be more forensic than the usual tribute, has to be forensic about its own evidence here. Multiple secondary accounts, attributed consistently to the royal biographer Robert Lacey, who had access to people who knew the family closely, including Princess Margaret, describe her in those first weeks as having been, beyond grief, something harder and more complicated, angry, bitter, and lost. The characterization has circulated widely in biographical literature and documentary summaries, attributed to Lacey's work and to an account Princess Margaret reportedly gave him. Robert Lacey's publications include his 2002 biography, Monarch: The Life and Reign of Elizabeth II, and several earlier works on the Queen Mother specifically, including God Bless Her, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. His method involved speaking at length with members of the family and the household. The angry and bitter characterization appears consistently in material attributed to his research. That characterization hasn't been confirmed in any primary text excerpt accessible to this account. No verbatim quotation from Princess Margaret on this subject appears in confirmed, accessible primary sources. The sourcing runs through secondary attributions, rather than a verified published passage from a specific Lacey volume with page number. This matters, and the distinction isn't pedantic. The emotional claim is the most dramatic in the story, and the story needs it to be handled at the correct epistemic level, which is, this is what biographers who spoke to people close to the family report, not what a document records. What can be said with more confidence is this. William Shawcross, who wrote the authorized biography with unrestricted access to her personal papers and letters, describes a woman who disliked confronting disagreeableness within the family, who put little controversy on paper as a matter of discipline, and who her staff nicknamed the Imperial Ostrich for her tendency to avoid acknowledging painful family dynamics. She had a self-imposed rule against discussing family matters in writing, not a soft preference, a rule. The authorized biographer, with everything available to him, depicts someone who kept her private self private as a matter of lifelong principle. There is then an additional layer. Princess Margaret destroyed large quantities of the Queen Mother's papers after her mother's death, correspondence about Princess Diana, personal letters, private communications that Margaret judged shouldn't survive. She stood in the same winter her mother had stood in 50 years before, and she made the same choice. Some things go with us. The private record of what Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon felt in February and March of 1952 is, by design, incomplete. The absence is itself informative. A woman of iron self-discipline who kept her feelings off paper as a matter of principle, and whose surviving papers were then reduced further by a devoted daughter. You don't find her grief in documents. You find it in what she did next. What she did next was choose a name. On the question of what to call a widowed queen consort, British practice offered a conventional answer: Dowager Queen or Queen Dowager. The term dowager in British heraldic usage denotes a woman whose title derives from a deceased husband, not a diminishment of rank, but a description of its origin. In formal address, a Queen Dowager in the British system is still styled Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. The word dowager describes the nature of the claim, not the rank in the room. But in practice, the formal title Queen Dowager had almost never been applied in the modern British royal house. The two preceding widowed queens offer the comparison directly. Queen Alexandra, widow of Edward VII and mother of George V, wasn't styled Dowager Queen after her husband died in 1910. She remained Her Majesty Queen Alexandra until her own death in 1925. No dowager, no mother, simply Queen Alexandra, as though the grammar of her status had not changed, only the king beside her. Queen Mary, widow of George V and mother of both Edward VIII and George VI, made an explicit and documented choice about this. She declined the title Queen Mother, her recorded reason being that she thought it implied advancing years. She remained Her Majesty Queen Mary throughout her widowhood, which lasted 17 years until her death in March 1953. She was a grandmother and then a great-grandmother, while still being formally addressed as though she were simply the queen. So neither of the two preceding widowed queens had used dowager in their formal styles. And the term Queen Mother wasn't, in 1952, a new invention. The phrase appears in English usage dating back to at least the early 1560s. The 1662 Book of Common Prayer describes Henrietta Maria, widow of Charles I and mother of Charles II, explicitly as Mary the Queen Mother. The title has a lineage. What happened in 1952 is that it was given, for the first time in the modern British monarchy, a formal and official application attached to a specific person's name. The documented rationale was practical. There were now two Queen Elizabeths, and some distinction was necessary. The official royal family website states plainly that she was known as Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, to avoid confusion with her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II. The Royal Collection Trust confirms Clarence House as the London home of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, from 1953 until 2002, using the title as the established institutional descriptor. No primary source has established that she personally refused the style Queen Dowager or demanded Queen Mother as her specific title. If she did, she didn't put it in writing, or the writing hasn't survived. And yet the account in Queen and Country, the 50-year reign of Elizabeth II, records the moment in these specific terms. A few days after her husband's death, her mother announced that she now wished to be called Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, and said, "I commend to you our dear daughter. Give her your loyalty and devotion." In that single reported act, announcing her own name and style while simultaneously endorsing her daughter, she claimed the title that would define her for the next 50 years. The endorsement was gracious. The self-naming wasn't passive. The distinction between Queen Dowager and Queen Mother is worth sitting with in terms of what each actually sounds like. Dowager derives from the Old French douagière, related to dower, the portion of an estate a widow inherits from her husband. A dowager is, linguistically, someone living on what was left. Mother is active, present, a relationship that exists in the moment. Dowager Queen announces loss. Queen Mother announces continuation. Queen Mother places Queen first, ahead of every modifier. Dowager carries connotations the word itself announces, something past, derived, dependent on a man now dead. Mother described what she still was, actively, in relation to the reigning monarch. Whether by personal preference or institutional convenience, the title she accepted wasn't the title of a woman stepping back. Her predecessor, Queen Mary, had refused Queen Mother because she didn't want to seem old. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon accepted it because it kept something essential intact, the word that had defined her for 16 years, still there, still first. The motive behind the choice is an interpretation, not a confirmed quotation. The consequence of the choice is a documented fact. From 1952 until March 30th, 2002, the word Queen remained attached to her name. It was always there, first and visible, in every announcement, every newsreel, every commemorative edition, every public toast. 50 years of the Queen Mother, not the former Queen, not the Queen Dowager. The Queen Mother, present tense, relational, still royal. She moved into Clarence House, the London residence adjacent to St. James's Palace, just before the coronation of June 2, 1953, and she stayed there until she died. The Royal Collection Trust describes it as the London home of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, from 1953 until 2002. 49 years in one house, nearly half a century of operation from a base that functioned, as some biographers have described it, as its own center of royal gravity. The house itself was transformed under her occupancy. She installed a new morning room in the space that had previously served as the Duke of Edinburgh's study, fitting it with a Georgian marble chimneypiece and a new plaster ceiling bearing her own crown. In 1960, she opened out 2 ground-floor rooms to form the garden room, a large sunlit space she described as well-suited to entertaining. All foreign heads of state called at Clarence House for tea on the first afternoon of every state visit to Britain. Not just some of them, all of them. Consider what that practice meant structurally. A foreign president or monarch arrives in London, and before the formal machinery of state begins, before the audience with the Queen, before the banquet at Buckingham Palace, before the speeches and the treaties, they went to tea with the Queen Mother. She was the first royal face they saw. She set the tone. For 50 years, Clarence House was the anteroom to the British throne, and she was the one who presided over it. The rooms were furnished with works she had collected across 60 years as a patron. Paintings by John Piper, Graham Sutherland, Walter Sickert, and Augustus John. More than 450 racehorses across her lifetime, with the Cheltenham Gold Cup a particular passion. She had a deep knowledge of these animals, of bloodlines and form, of the peculiar combination of science and instinct that horse racing demands. It was a world she moved through as an expert, not as a ceremonial presence. The racing world knew her as someone who understood what she was watching. That expertise, that specific earned competence in a domain that matters intensely to a large slice of British life, was part of her presence too. She continued an active schedule of public engagements throughout the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and into the 1990s. She remained, as biographers consistently note, a consistently popular member of the family, even at times when other royals were suffering serious damage to their public standing. The 1990s were brutal for the House of Windsor. The separation and divorce of Charles and Diana, the Windsor Castle fire in November 1992, the Queen's own description of that year as her annus horribilis, the sustained press campaign against the royal family as an institution. Throughout all of it, the Queen Mother's standing held. The tabloids that tore apart other royals left her alone. She was the one who retained the public's unconditional affection, even as everything around her was being re-examined and contested. That untouchability was itself a kind of power. You can't be managed, overruled, or repositioned if you can't be criticized. Elizabeth II, who could be criticized, who was criticized, whose cold response to Diana's death in 1997 nearly collapsed the monarchy's public standing in a single week, operated under constraints her mother didn't face. The finances of the Queen Mother's post-1952 life are a matter of wide biographical record without being a matter of confirmed official documentation. Her civil list annuity, the parliamentary grant covering her household expenses, was £643,000 per year, a figure that biographical accounts consistently describe as inadequate to cover her actual spending. Estimates of her real annual expenditure run between £1 million and £2 million. The gap between income and spending was a standing feature of her widowhood. The racehorses, the entertaining at Clarence House and at the Castle of May, the remote Scottish property she had bought and restored in the early 1950s on the far north coast of Caithness, purchased in a moment that some biographers read as a gesture of deliberate isolation, a retreat to the edge of the country where the sea ran cold and the nearest neighbors were miles away. The staff required to run multiple royal residences at the scale she maintained, the art collecting, the hosting, the life she was determined to live at the scale she considered appropriate to who she was. Ben Pimlett, biographer of Elizabeth II, described the relationship in terms that have become the standard critical summary. Elizabeth II indulged her mother, helped to finance her, and, on occasions, stepped aside to allow her to take center stage. The Financial Times reported in 2008, citing a 1959 financial crisis at Clarence House, that the Queen subsidized her mother and was reported to have paid off her overdraft at Coutts Bank. Some accounts place that overdraft at approximately £4 million at various points. These figures are reported by biographers and journalists, rather than confirmed by bank records or palace documents. They are presented here as what they are: widely repeated, consistent with the structural facts of her expenditure, and unconfirmed at primary level. What is documented is this. 8 years before her death, the Queen Mother placed an estimated £19 million into trusts for her great-grandchildren. When she died on March 30, 2002, her estate was estimated at between £50 million and £70 million, including art, jewelry, horses, and personal effects. Under a memorandum agreed in 1993, drafted while the Queen Mother was 93 years old and still very much alive, property passing from a consort of a former sovereign to the current monarch is exempt from inheritance tax. An estimated £28 million in inheritance tax liability wasn't incurred when that estate passed to Elizabeth II. The architecture of that 1993 arrangement is, in its own way, the clearest picture of how the relationship worked. The Queen Mother was, at 93, still being consulted on formal legal structures that concerned her property. Her daughter arranged the memorandum, which served both of them. Elizabeth II had been quietly financing her mother's way of life for decades. Her mother had been quietly accumulating an estate that would pass back to her daughter tax-free. They had built an elegant financial circuit that ran in both directions. Indulgence, in both the emotional and the fiscal sense, was part of how they maintained the equilibrium. The daughter perpetually managing a mother who outranked her emotionally, and perhaps the mother understanding that being managed gracefully was itself a form of power. The authorized biography by William Shawcross, written with unrestricted access to her papers, gives a portrait that is careful not to flatten her. She disliked confrontation. She avoided acknowledging family problems. She was, in the assessment of some of her contemporaries, easier to revere from a distance than to navigate closely. Tony Skevington's characterization is worth returning to. Beneath the affable veneer, there has always been a very strong, extremely sensible, shrewd, and, some would say, ruthless woman. Those words aren't from an enemy. They are from a careful analyst trying to explain how someone who projected femininity and warmth and gentle humor managed, in practice, to be one of the most consequential figures in the 20th century British establishment for 8 decades. She wasn't decorative. She was, as Skevington puts it, load-bearing. She had helped hold a shy, stammering, terrified man through the worst war in human history, had helped him carry a crown he'd never wanted, had given the nation a symbol of domestic stability at precisely the moment the nation needed it most. She had done this so effectively that Britain never fully understood how hard it was, or how deliberate. After his death, she remained load-bearing, just not for him anymore. For herself and for the position she had decided not to relinquish. The private gap between the Queen Mother the public knew and the Queen Mother her family knew is, by her own design, largely unverifiable. She kept controversy off paper. Princess Margaret destroyed the papers that survived. What remains in the authorized record is the charming, measured, publicly constructed self, the letters edited by Shawcross, the selected correspondence, the gracious handwritten notes that reveal a woman of real warmth and genuine wit, someone who could be unexpectedly fluent and thoughtful in private exchange. What was burned or withheld is the rest. Whatever anger existed in those first February weeks of 1952, whatever bitterness about the abdication and Wallace Simpson, and the crown taken once and then handed on, it went into the fire with everything else she chose not to leave. That is itself a kind of self-governance, and it's entirely consistent with the 50-year pattern. She gave nothing away that she didn't choose to give. The 50 years between February 1952 and March 2002 aren't, in themselves, a scandal. They are something less dramatic and more durable, a structural fact about the British monarchy that has no precise parallel in the modern era. In the normal course of royal succession, a widowed queen consort recedes. The new monarch's spouse becomes the dominant royal partner. The older generation moves to the ceremonial margins. Queen Mary completed this transition the fastest way possible, by dying in March 1953, 13 months after the king, just weeks before Elizabeth II's coronation on June 2nd. Her death cleared the field. The generation before Elizabeth II was gone. Except it wasn't. The Queen Mother was 51 in 1952, and she would live for another 50 years. She outlived Queen Mary by 49 years. She outlived her husband by 50. She would be an active presence in British public life through the entire reign of her daughter, through 11 prime ministers from Churchill to Blair, through the death of Princess Diana, through the collapse and partial reconstruction of the royal family's public standing in the 1990s, through the Golden Jubilee celebrations of 2002, which she didn't quite live to see complete. She didn't fill the space of her widowhood quietly. She occupied it at full scale. In the 1950s, as Elizabeth II was establishing herself as a new monarch, navigating Winston Churchill, then Anthony Eden, then Harold Macmillan, learning the constitutional machinery, undertaking the exhausting Commonwealth tours, her mother was running a parallel operation at Clarence House. Same city, same ceremonial world, same public. Two Queen Elizabeths, the younger one nominally senior, the older one drawing on 30 years of accumulated affection and the specific charisma of a woman the nation had watched stand in rubble and refuse to leave. What Elizabeth II appears to have understood, or accepted, or simply navigated around, is that challenging this wasn't a viable option. You couldn't publicly rebuke a woman whose wartime conduct had made her a national institution. You couldn't diminish someone the public wouldn't allow to be diminished. So you worked around it. You indulged it. You paid for it when the bills arrived. And you watched, for 50 years, as the phrase, the Queen Mother, remained synonymous in popular imagination with something slightly larger than the woman who held it, with wartime courage, with domestic constancy, with the British monarchy at its most human and its most enduring. Whether she intended this half-century of maintained presence as a resistance to diminishment, or whether she simply lived her life at the scale she considered appropriate, can't be answered from what remains. Her own assessment of what she was doing died with her, or before her, in the papers that burned. What remains is the record of what she did. She stayed, she engaged, she received, she rode, she collected, she hosted, she waved, and she held the title first and visible, for as long as her body permitted. On March 30th, 2002, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, died peacefully at Royal Lodge, Windsor. She was 101 years old. Elizabeth II was at her bedside. Her younger daughter, Princess Margaret, had died 7 weeks earlier, on February 9th, the 50th anniversary of the accession declaration, formally confirming Elizabeth II as Queen. The Queen Mother had lived to bury both her husband and the child who had stood beside her through the worst winter of her life. Her funeral drew the kind of attendance his had drawn 50 years before. Her coffin was carried from the Royal Chapel of All Saints at Royal Lodge, traveled to St. James's Palace, and lay in state at Westminster Hall. Crowds lined the route, thousands deep. Some had queued through the night. Her coronet rested on the coffin, alongside a wreath of white camellias from the Queen. She had directed, as part of her funeral arrangements, that she be buried in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at St. George's, Windsor, in the vault that already held her husband, the man she had married in 1923, who had become king against his will and hers, and whom she had outlasted by exactly 50 years and 52 days. The newsreaders, in their obituaries and reports, repeated the phrase that had followed her since February 1952. The Queen Mother, not the former Queen, not the Queen Dowager, the Queen Mother, present tense even in death, relational still. When George VI died at Sandringham in the early hours of February 6, 1952, he made his daughter a queen. The Accession Council met at 5 o'clock. The proclamation was read from the Proclamation Gallery at St. James's Palace to the sound of trumpet blasts from the lifeguards, and the ancient succession machinery clicked into place with the precision of something that had been practiced for centuries. There was no ceremony required to make Elizabeth II queen. The accession was instantaneous. It had happened while she was sleeping in a treehouse in Kenya, watching animals come to drink from a waterhole in the dark. What the death also made, and what no council meeting could manage, was the 50-year negotiation that followed. George VI had made Elizabeth II a queen. He had also made her the only monarch in modern memory who would spend her entire reign sharing the stage with a mother who had not entirely finished being one. They loved each other. The evidence for that is clear, and it matters, because the story only works as tragedy if the love was real. But love doesn't eliminate structure, and the structure of what followed was this. The crown passed in 1952, but the word attached to it was slower. Queen Mother placed Queen first. Queen Mother placed her still in relation to the throne. Queen Mother kept her for 50 years in the same ceremonial universe as her daughter, present at the same occasions, receiving the same heads of state, drawing the same crowds, holding the same title she had held since December 11th, 1936, when an abdication she had never asked for made her one. The crown changed hands at Sandringham in 1952. That part was clean and instantaneous. The word queen, that was a harder transfer. It took 50 years and 101 candles and the final authority of the body when the will had long since been outrun. The title ended on March 30th, 2002. So did the woman who held it. Subscribe for more stories like this.